All right, welcome everyone. This is our class, a survey of the New Testament. We first want to start us off by just talking about the New Testament. Like, what is the New Testament? Why do we have these 27 books? And how do we actually get the New Testament? That's what I want to focus on in today's lecture. So let us begin. So let me start this way. Would you be able to identify the books that record the true story of Jesus if you were a first century Christian when there was no such thing as the New Testament canon? Now, I want to start us off with this question because when we're thinking about the New Testament, we're often thinking about the world of the early Christians, or at least the first Christians that emerged on the scene after the life and death of Jesus. But more specifically, we also have to step back a bit because a lot of the books that we have within the New Testament weren't automatically written after Jesus died. In fact, some of the first letters or books of the New Testament that were written were not the Gospels, but were actually the letters of Paul. But eventually, they did manage to collect these 27 books that we have in our Bibles. This process, though, was not an easy process. And to help us understand a little bit of what early Christians went through, I want to start us off with a story. This is actually a real situation that happened. In the second century, we had this one bishop. This one bishop, his name was Serapion. Now, they asked him a question about this book that they were reading in church, and this was called the Gospel of Peter. Now, he himself didn't really know about this gospel. He didn't really know where it came from or anything, but he was just like, "Hey, this is Peter's gospel. If it says it's the Gospel of Peter, just read it. It shouldn't be no problem." And so he writes this to the church. He says, "Look, when I visited you, I suppose that all of you held the true faith, and as I had not read the gospel which they put forward in the name of Peter, I said that if this is the only thing which occasions dispute among you, let it be read." Notice here, the bishop is addressing a church that is divided, or at least debating over whether or not they should read the Gospel of Peter. Now, you also have to keep in mind, this is a time in which there was no such thing as the New Testament. And this bishop, this early Christian leader, just assumed because it was supposedly written by Peter that it shouldn't be a problem. But when he finally was able to get a copy of this gospel, he realized that this earlier recommendation, him telling the church to go ahead and read the Gospel of Peter, was a major mistake. And so he tells them, "But now, having learned from what has been told me that their mind was involved in some heresy, I will hasten to come to you again. Therefore, brethren, expect me shortly." In other words, he's like, "Look, I got hold of this gospel, and I now realize that there is some issues, and I'm gonna go visit you, and we're gonna talk it out." This bishop eventually goes to the church, and he helps them understand or at least recognize why the Gospel of Peter should not be read or received by these early Christians. But what we also find was that this is an example of some of the challenges that the early Christians had in discerning which are the proper books that should be kept, read, and used to help develop early Christians. But what is the Gospel of Peter? Now, we don't have the entire Gospel in its completion, but instead we have like some fragments of the Gospel, especially parts towards the end of Jesus' life, the final days of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. This gospel was found by French archaeologists who were working in Egypt. Now, it's called the Gospel of Peter because in this gospel writes from the perspective of Peter, because Peter is generally speaking in the first person. Now, this gospel is also dated to the mid second century, but the earliest manuscript is traced to the sixth century. When you're reading this gospel, what you'll notice is that it seems to follow the same plot that we find in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it also gives us a twist to the death of Jesus. It gives us like this alternative version. Now, this gospel includes a lot of interesting details that are found within the four gospels. But there's also other details that are only found in this gospel. One particular incident is when the soldiers who are guarding the tomb, they hear a voice from heaven speak to Jesus, and the voice says, "Have you made proclamation to those who have fallen asleep?" And then there's a response, and that is also spoken back to the voice from heaven. Now, these little details, they're not major in the sense that they are easily noticed, but they're just placed in the gospel that unless you're familiar with the original version, the gospel of Peter would seem like a legitimate gospel. We also find a very similar plot. We see Jesus, who's not only in the tomb, but also Pontius Pilate, Mary Magdalene, and many others, you know, arriving at the tomb or involved in the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. You see the women also, just like in the Gospel of Mark, they flee and they leave the tomb. They're frightened and afraid. You also see the story of the 12 disciples who are weeping at home. Andrew also going to fish. But overall, if you're reading this gospel, you wouldn't really find anything major that's unordinary or at least something that's out of place. It reads just like the other gospels. It includes all the main characters: King Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Roman soldiers at the tomb, Joseph of Arimathea, who helps bring down the body of Jesus and bury the body of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, angels, all the main characters are there. But there's also different details that are found in this gospel. It gives us details why Jesus' body was given to Joseph of Arimathea. It also tells us why the disciples fled, making mention that they were afraid. But then it also provides us further details that are just a bit off. It says that Jesus is on the cross and he's described as someone who seems to have no pain. And also, we can notice that nowhere in the gospel is Jesus described as a Christ. He's always described as Lord. And another thing that just seems a bit off is that Jesus calls God his power. You can also notice some anti-Semitic elements. It describes the Jewish people as actually rejoicing when Jesus dies. There's also an additional element. There's a large crowd that comes from Jerusalem to come and visit the sealed tomb. And one of the things that's perhaps the most striking about this gospel is that there is a talking cross with gigantic angels whose describes their heads reach the heavens. So there's these additional elements that are in this gospel that are just a bit odd. Overall, it is a very embellished gospel. Some exaggerations, symbolic imagery, and unless you're familiar with the original story of Jesus, you would not notice that there was something wrong with this gospel. Now, how does the bishop respond? 'Cause keep in mind, he had earlier told them to go read the gospel because it was written by Peter. But now that he himself had realized that he gave bad advice, he needs to clean up the mess that he created. And so here's what he says. He says, "For having obtained this gospel from others who had studied it diligently, namely from those who had first used it, we have been able to read it through, and we find many things in accordance with the true doctrine of the Savior, but some things added to that doctrine, which we have pointed out for you farther on." In other words, yes, there's some parts of this gospel that sound authentic, but there's other parts of the gospel that are not. And overall, the Gospel of Peter was retelling the story of Jesus by borrowing aspects from the authentic Gospels while mixing in other things that were not necessarily reflective of the Jesus tradition. But what does this all show us? And why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because in the early Christian communities, what we find is that it was very difficult for them to discern which are the appropriate books of the New Testament. Because what we can notice is that there were many other false gospels that were written and spread and shared. And during this time, both false gospels and the true gospels were read and received and spread amongst many early Christian churches. And additionally, not all early Christians had a general sense on the difference between the true gospel and the false gospel. And perhaps a very important point is that determining which gospels are legitimate involved the community of the early Christian leaders, especially the bishops of the church. Because there was no New Testament the way we have it now in the first couple of centuries of the early Christian church, the role of the Christian community and the role of the leaders was vitally important. It was very important. Today, we don't have this challenge because what the early Christian community did throughout the centuries was help filter out some of these books that were inauthentic, and those that preserve the authentic memory of Jesus were kept by the early Christians. It was a community that helped the early Christians select, reject, and also organize the New Testament into what we have today. Now, this did take some time, but the first couple of centuries of the early church, they did not have a New Testament the way we have it today. Instead, they primarily relied on their understanding and reading of the Old Testament by the oral traditions, and they had some books. Not all of them. We do know that the letters of Paul were being circulated by the second century, and some communities were reading some books, some gospels, like the Gospel of Mark or Matthew. They seemed to gravitate, or at least they were read and circulated among certain regions. It took time overall for the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, for them to finally emerge and become canonized. But in the early Christian church, such a thing was difficult without the bishop